So I'm here now with a different hat on. So I'm trying to organize this session. And I'm really happy to welcome here two very different perspectives again, on this time on the question of responsibility. We will get started with Roberto De Loro, who will invite us to take a more broader picture, broader vision of what responsibility means and how we should maybe practice it today. And then we'll switch to the more practical question of how can responsibility be practiced in a highly sophisticated research environment. And I'm very happy that Markus Meurer from Lisbon will talk about his research and which elements of responsibility are involved in his endeavors in biomedicine. I can add that our third speaker of this afternoon has not arrived. We don't know yet, or she has not arrived. So that means we have a little bit more time for the two presentations. And after that, we will engage in our discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Which means that I have a little bit more of an expansive opportunity to present my thoughts. I think postprandial presentations are always a little bit more complex. And so I ask of you what the Germans would call the Anstrengung des Begriffs, which I would translate as perhaps the effort to think, in part because I don't have any PowerPoint. And so I'm sort of presenting more like a little paper. I promise to stay within, say, 10, 15 minutes top. In my presentation, I take the lead from the reference to responsibility, which frames the general concerns of this panel. Since Hans Jonas brought the notion in question back to the center of ethical preoccupations in his famous book, The Principle of Responsibility, it has become impossible to think about the future of scientific research in any area affecting human life without taking into account the categorical nature of a new imperative. Act in such a way that the maxim governing the goals of science be compatible with the survival of humankind and the well-being of future generations. The future may still unfolds with the promise of hope, as Ernst Bloch had somewhat optimistically suggested before Jonas, but utopian expectations ought to rest now on a precautionary responsibility more skeptical toward the intentions of human praxis. We have become uncertain about our ability to effect a living space still hospitable to the survival of the species and the continuation of life on Earth. In my paper, I address the question of responsibility with respect to human genome editing. More specifically, I offer a philosophical critique, for the time I have, of the prevailing bioethical discourse on the practice in question, and plead in the name of responsibility for an alternative, perhaps more expansive approach. Mine is a critique of the principle-based approach, as we know, the dominant methodology, framing not only the general features of bioethics, especially American bioethics, but also the many areas of public ethical engagement, including the area of human genome editing. According to the such widespread version of bioethics, ethical argumentation reduces to evidentiary plausibility, potentially intelligible without any deeper philosophical commitment, whether anthropological or metaphysical, let alone theological. Human genome editing is a case in point. Reference to the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, though differently orchestrated in their application, are ubiquitous in the statements of official bodies. They seem to have a prima facie validity, not only in terms of their normative weight, but also with respect to a taken for granted linguistic shallowness. Thus, non-maleficence will be reduced to safety, beneficence to social benefit, autonomy to freedom of research, justice to fair distribution of resources, etc. The call for a moratorium on reproductive germline modification by the 2017 National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine report, the acronym is NASEM, rests on such principle-based strategy. As sociologist John Evans has shown, the public discussion seems less driven by the quality of ethical arguments and more by a pragmatic willingness to accept developments on the slippery slope of scientific advancements. The only provisor is that the sliding down the slope be justified in the name of beneficence, autonomy, or fairness in the distribution of resources. Thus, what functioned as barriers in genetics yesterday, Buchanan, Brock, Daniels, and Wickler in their influential book From Chance to Choice refer to them as moral fire breaks. So these barriers then can quickly turn into less stringent speed bumps today once the conditions for moving down the slope are eventually met in the name of relieving suffering or bodily autonomy. In this logic, a deontologically grounded ban can turn into a temporary moratorium waiting to be further removed by a consequentialist calculus on the potential benefit for the greatest number or the unjustified encroachment on the freedom of the few. Take the case of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. If one accepts PGD for the selection of certain genetic traits, one will very soon justify the modification of genetic traits as well. In this case, procreative liberty will function as the grease, to keep the metaphor going, on the slope toward full and unencumbered reproductive autonomy. In the application of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, NASEM advocated that germline interventions be restricted to, quote, preventing serious disease or condition and editing genes that have convincingly demonstrated to cause or to strongly predispose to the disease or condition, end quote. The report supported converting such genes to versions that are prevalent in the population and are known to be associated with ordinary health with little or no evidence of adverse effects. Now, with these conditions, NASEM not only pulled down in a sweep the previously established barrier invoked for gene therapy applications, which distinguish between interventions on somatic and germline cells, It also overturned the barrier that allowed therapeutic interventions while banning those leading to enhancement. Furthermore, it introduced a shift in the argument used to justify germline modification, since the intervention to stop an embryo from having a disease was actually not about disease, health, or the reduction of suffering, that is, beneficence toward the children that are born, but about the parental desire for genetically related children. So one can see in light of the last case mentioned that in addition to problems concerning the reductive notion of the values in question, there is also the issue of defining the normative strategy for privileging them in the process of application. Which principle should prevail and why? In technical terms, what guides the balancing process given the potentially equal weight of different principles at stake? Does beneficence override justice, or should autonomy prevail over safety? What moved over the barrier in the germline gene editing endorsed by NASEM was not the initial commitment to beneficence, but rather the new dominant value of autonomy. The desire to have genetically related children may arise from a variety of factors. The report bemoans the fact that, quote, precluding access to this technology could be regarded as limiting parental autonomy, end quote. So if people want to have children with a particular attribute, then they have the right to do so. So much for the general quality of ethical arguments and the logic with which they function. So I suggest to retrieve a more critical stance, which entails, at the minimum, broadening the horizon of our own reasoning. It might also call for a different attunement to what I would refer to, perhaps in a bigger paper, to the primal ethos of life. The first calls for epistemological recharging, the second for renewed metaphysical sensibility. Just a few words about the first. The horizon of meaning I seek is more than a normative theory, nor is it simply a work in theory, as Beauchamp and Childress have claimed in the latest iterations of their widely read principles of biomedical ethics. At stake here is the interplay of ethics and philosophical anthropology, because ethics always depends upon broader anthropological commitments. To ask how we ought to behave is to do so implicitly or explicitly on the background of presumed notions of human flourishing and fulfillment. The methodological broadening I'm calling for is not new in contemporary moral philosophy. It finds expression in the attempt to recast the relation between rightness and goodness, and in the retrieval of eudaimonistic ethical theories. Consult McIntyre, Taylor, William Desmond, among others. The philosophical work of much contemporary bioethics, on the other hand, is a secular exercise not devoid of theoretical acuity in the articulation of right actions and practices. The good, however, remains incognito, impossible to define on a purely empirical basis, too elusive to grasp in its metaphysical meaning. The four principles of bioethics, will be played out then according to strategies of balancing or specification without explicit reference to any underlying theory of the good. In reality, what is only recessive remains no less effective. A theory of the good will be smuggled through, as I have mentioned before, either in the utilitarian version with the tilt towards social beneficence, or in the deontological one with a preference for autonomy. A different strategy, however, one saturated with notions of human fulfillment and flourishing, remains out of this methodological picture. So I conclude, because we don't have much time. What of human genome editing then? What of the promise of improved health and potential eradication of disease? What of the dream in the progress of science and medicine toward an ever more sanitized, perhaps better version of the world? Can we distinguish between hubristic pretense, mindless of limitations, and honest commitment to the alleviation of suffering, still calling for inevitable compromises between risks and benefits, the courage to chip away at the security of precautionary measures in the hope for what lies ahead toward futuristic benefits awaiting us in return? Mine is not an invitation to eschew ethical discernment in favor of reactionary posturing, or worse, paralyzing anguish. But forward thinking can either mean proceeding impatiently toward the progress defined by lack of reverence for life and the dignity of human beings, or journeying in fear and trembling, this is the lesson of Hans Jonas, toward a future attentive to the fragile nature of life and the love of being that surpasses any manipulative pretense and exploitation. Can such a love of being, the love of life, find universal articulation? How can it be framed within the limits of a public argument, fully domesticated within the boundaries of univocal reasoning? Perhaps the reasons of the good can never be good enough. If so, they would be like Pascal's reason of the heart, reasons of which reason knows nothing. This testimonial character of any moral discourse requires, in the end, witness to the good in addition to the ability to solve radically ethical quandaries. This means recognizing the inevitable poverty of any ethical discourse. Only a humble ethics can be, in my opinion, a responsible ethics. An ethics that finds its completion beyond itself, in a transcending movement of self-giving into the vast yet promising ocean of life itself, the bios of bioethics. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thorough and also stimulating and thoughtful introduction into what responsibility means and should mean today in our discourse, and how difficult it is to put that into practice, and how deep and wide we would need to think and feel to make this happen, at least to a certain extent. And now we switch to the reality of doing sciences, biomedical sciences, and and to the question of how can some of these aspects be implemented into daily research work.
So first of all, thank you very much. And this was I really enjoyed this very much because it took us away from flashy slides. It forced us to listen, which is very rare. It forced us to think. So this was really the stretch between Pierre Pascal's notion of the reasons of the heart and the pragmatic arguments to be benevolent, that utilitarianism comes through the back door, disguised in many forms. So what I'm going to, I would sign up, and I'm very thankful for these reflections. Being a medical doctor and a priest and a medical doctor, I used to lecture before medical students, so it has to be slides, because because the attention span is they would have a problem actually after a few seconds. So so what I'm going to share with you are some reflections on something very practical. So it has nothing to do with germline, has to do with the use of genetically engineered platforms in cell therapies. So I saddled the horse, I thought, from a different way, and being here in Rome, the son of a timberman 2,000 years ago, the son of man, asked somebody very pragmatic, what do you want? How can I help you? And the person didn't ask, well, you know, I want to have more passion, I want to have more, I want to bear my sufferings, I want to see. Could see. And this is, so that's a very pragmatic answer, and this is what the Lord was very pleased. Responsibility between, and this is in the context of cell therapy, that we can't do it, or positive doctrine, one of our favorite theologian, Yves Congar, born 1904, died 1995, 1 year as a deacon cardinal, was influenced by many great French theologians, and had a very pragmatic approach, also in the context how he made things workable during the Second Vatican Council, and he brought something in discussion, positive doctrine. How can we make something work with the instruments that we have? And I'd like to make 3 points in the context of cell therapy. Use existing technologies, because what we have, what we can do, not only just to put genes in and out, we can work with epigenetic methods. For instance, is far away actually what's done in clinical trials. Number 2, the courage and the financial coverage. These are mundane things that you alluded to, but these are things that we need to cripple. And Bambino Gesù is one of the great examples, because essentially it was donation that enabled to do cell therapies here for children, for instance, with neuroblastomas, which usually have quite a problem to survive if they have this crippling disease. And access. Then the actually, it's not research, it's clinical development. So my home is as a private non-profit foundation in Lisbon, the Jean-Paul Aymar Foundation. This is where Vasco da Gama put the boat in the water and was going to the Indies. So it was prepared for the unknown as much as possible. And what we did is we created a cell center, because we thought that for cell therapy, with about 11 production rooms that are going to be functional. It's going to be Europe's most advanced non-industrial academic cell therapy center. And for that, and this takes it away from research, we acquired from Stanford the rights for CRISPR-Cas9 for therapeutic applications for CRISPR-Cas9, and we license it to Kite Gilead. So it enabled us really to use this with partners in developing cell therapies. That's one of the facilities in which cell therapies are being made. It's essentially very clean rooms, and essentially if I would have had, I would have been gray during this last 3 years. But I mean, this is it's a major practical hurdle in order to make things accessible. Building smart CAR-T therapies is a challenge. These are cells that are genetically engineered, usually using a retrovirus, most likely now a lentivirus, and other possibilities through genetically modified cells. And there are many ways to have cells have a smarter decision making. It's not only to put a gene in and out. There's a way, essentially, if you tickle a cell, that then something comes out, or we can use drugs in order, without touching the genetic code, that gives a safety margin, but also is able to monitor therapies much more closely. And we worked with colleagues in order to put this white paper forward, how we can make decision-making cells in cell therapy available. Now I learned how to use that gadget here. Is just, I mean, this is too technical, but for instance, what you, this is a protein, it's associated with cancer, HER2, it's a growth factor. And for instance, we have a molecule that would recognize it. It's most of you know that in colorectal cancer, breast cancer. There's a lot of intracellular bureaucracy going on, decision making, and one of the smart cell therapies is when this binds. There are different elements from a tobacco H virus, there are kind of different smart ways to engineer a cell, and then without changing genetic pool, it's not a live Cas. It's not, it's a dead Cas9 that is not changing the genetic code. We can instruct it with so-called guide RNAs, do this, do that. So we can tell it to induce gene-bound contact or by using drugs. So this is possible. So advancement in science helps us to use cell therapies that are smarter, safer, and are tailored without touching the genetic code. And this just gives an overview. This, for instance, if you have one positive signal and another positive signal, only then you do something, or if this is present, you don't do anything. So there are different ways, even of complex synthetic genes that don't even exist in nature, that help us to make these cells more intelligent. Donum vitae, gene therapies can be acceptable as long as they're strictly therapeutic. That is to say, the gene therapy is used to treat a genetic disease. In dignitatis personae, so the normal genetic configuration of the patient to counter damage caused by genetic anomalies, were morally acceptable. And we heard this just this morning, just right now, essentially, that this can be, with the wrong sound effect, may lead to consequences that we don't want to see. What happened to cell therapy? There was a treatment that has nothing to do with genetic engineering, but it was some sort of a hooray effect. This was 1987 when the director of surgery from the NIH, Professor Steven Rosenberg, took cells out from the patient. That these cells sit within cancer cells. They sit there for a reason. One could argue they lost a battle. One could also argue they know the enemy best. They're the soldiers that are close to cancer cells. So these cells are extracted from the tumor, expanded outside of the human body, and then being reinfused. This took about more than 25 years to put this into a product. The big company, it's Iovance, that approved, this was approved now the 17th of February this year. the first time the cell therapy, non-genetically, for patients with melanoma, metastatic melanoma, important, who failed all therapies. So they went through many, so that's the last line. And if we would go before that, essentially the response rate would be much higher. Genetically engineered cells. There are a number of companies, and this is multiple myeloma. It's a blood cancer. This just gives you here an overview. The response rate is about 20% of hematological malignancies can be addressed with these cell therapies. But, and I discussed it during lunch, it depends on the country, about only 15–20% of patients may have access to that, or once they have access, they're so sick they're not able to undergo these kind of therapies. And there is a cost associated with that. So this appears to be an issue. Then that's the responsibility point. There was a letter issued the 28th of November 2023 from the Food and Drug Administration. But what happened is that upon screening patients who has received these therapies, and the first was approved in 2016, ended up with lymphomas. So if we look at the numbers, and I looked at very carefully last night, there were in spring this year, 17,700 patients have been treated with cell therapy, and 12 patients ended up with a lymphoma, so 0.068%. And things kind of calm down, but it depends where the lentivirus or the retrovirus integrates, and nobody really looks at the integration of these therapies. So there's also a danger signal that was people where there were side effects as many other therapies that we do with patients, and these are, for instance, the indications that have been approved. Borotropolic, who was a pioneer who moved HIV, actually had quite a trouble getting this through, moved HIV to a therapeutic lentivirus backbone, who made a point that these very expensive therapies could be more affordable. And he put up networks in Brazil as well as in India. Lentiviral vectors, therefore people were very, we were also kind of, what should we do now? There are possibilities that there is an integration that is not a blind flight where the virus integrates into the genome. Again, these are therapies for patients with usually end-stage cancer where all other possibilities of treatments are being exhausted. And but there are also viral-like particles, the nanorobots, smart artificial cells on the horizon. There's a lot of things happening that we are looking forward. I like you to, I read this here because usually what there is this mantra that people say, well, the product is the process. And somebody said, well, yes, but it's not true anymore, because the material that we start, if we don't use artificial cells or something that is generally off the shelf, usually these are cells from the same patient. It's autologous, most cases. It's autologous. And then, so it's a black box. So my cells that went through many therapies, my genetic imprint, my experience of my cells are different than your cells that are then genetically being altered. And the point here is that insight is still important, but it's insufficient. As industry adapts to increasingly complex manufacturing practices, the data is the deliverable. So there is really a point that once these therapies are being done, it should be guided. Why are we successful? And why are we not successful with these therapies? And how can we share this data? I think this is also part of a tremendous possibility. I'd like to almost conclude with kind of a bird view. If you look at cell therapies, about 20% of malignancies could, but are not being, could be employed with transgenic cells. Patients with solid cancer, nobody wants to touch it. There's more clinical trials. There's a lot of going on in the field, but this is not being touched. But these are the major, this breast cancer, colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, and everything's right. But we don't really have a solution here. Why is that? And I like to, I mean, there is a compartmentalization going on, because these are three different structures that we are used to. These are three instruments. Either it's academia with high competence, but usually not with the competence to make a product based on that, you know, it can be used also at a different institution. So it usually takes industry 2 or 3 years until the knowledge is thrown over the fence and turned into a product that can be approved by the EMA or the FDA. Resources, academic institutions don't have the money to do it, and policy issues, essentially, really to run very good phase 1 or phase 2A clinical trials and not compassionate use. The costs, the time to develop this, and the risks associated, this is throughout the point. Small companies, they usually have 1 or 2 products. The issue is that they 95% fail. They fall, they don't have access to clinical material, and big industry now usually doesn't invest in these treatments in cell therapy for patients with solid cancer. There's this kind of winter of investment or disenchantment, and we don't know how to overcome it. Government and insurance goes for a certain way. Intellectual property, data, and combinatorial therapies is probably an entire half an hour to discuss. I like to end with that. Actually, that's if I would have a reason. This is a T-cell receptor repertoire. Beauty that may be deceiving, and there was a science editor recently said, well, beauty may not be the truth. But these are the cells in blue is immune cells that infiltrate the tumor, and yellow cells are the ones that mediated regression in this cancer. And what you see, there is a beautiful organization. It looks like stars that light up the heaven. And I think there is a lot of structural beauty, là pour là, but still, this is something we need to have data in order. We have the responsibility to unearth that. So these are the core people that have been helping to put things into developmental practice, and we hope that we are able to help patients with solid cancer, where patients with hematological malignancies already able to enjoy therapeutic platforms. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the beautiful picture, and especially for introducing us to the challenges or the potential beneficial outcome of cell therapies. Thank you very much indeed. So now we are here on the panel on responsibility, and we see 2 different ways of approaching them, more on a general level and more on the practical level. And maybe this stimulates also questions from your fields where you are working to see what kind of responsibility is present, and what do you see as the responsibilities that would need to be taken, and what are the challenges? Because you also mentioned the huge challenges of how, if you want to bring about the good, let's say the new therapies, what challenges do you need to meet to make them work? So maybe in the first round, we could also try to bring together from your experience, where you see the challenges, where you see the opportunities, and try to integrate them. Yeah, of course.
Just an observation which could perhaps help frame the debate further. It seems to me that one of the problems of science today is what is known as the value-free attempt to define science purely in terms of facts and results. On the other hand, the preoccupation of philosophy, the preoccupation for ethics, is to integrate these facts with considerations of values. Now, this kind of dualism is, of course, problematic and would make any attempt to, to articulate the question of ethical responsibility impossible. Because the question of responsibility is, first of all, internal to the scientific work itself. So in that sense, the question Sigrid asked might be the question of what responsibility means for the scientist. Before we get to the issue of how is it that philosophically we may frame the issue of responsibility, which in my presentation I basically articulated in terms of a critique of the kind of approach in philosophy, more specifically in bioethics, that ends up being parasitical on the developments of science. In that sense, if there has to be a serious philosophical discourse on responsibility, that has to be based on stepping back from science, and therefore offering a critical edge that might not be there in the work of the scientist. But then the question for me as a philosopher, as an ethicist, might be, what does it mean for the scientist to be responsible? What exactly is the meaning of a scientific work that confronts not only the question of factual results, but the question of ends, the question of goals, the question of the sort of ultimate meaning of a certain type of hypothesis and ultimately of a certain type of scientific discovery.
So on this topic of responsibility and the idea of the cost of personalized diagnostics and personalized therapies came up a lot in Marcus's talk. And so I kind of want to ask the question of who has the responsibilities to resolve this problem if it is in fact resolvable? And can you talk a little bit about the conflicting values in resolving the price problem for personalized therapies?
Yes, sure. I mean, just to give you about the numbers we're talking about, because maybe not everybody in the room knows about it. If you look about non-genetically modified cells, that's about, the price tag is $500,000 for patients with stage 4 melanoma that underwent already very costly therapies, right? And the genetically modified cells for hematological malignancies are anywhere between 320,000, 480,000 or so. So then but what are the so can we bring down, and then there is the third point is the issue of accessibility. Is this then a therapy for the rich? Actually, when I was at the dentist recently, somebody was drilling my tooth. Said, you know, my mother had a malignancy, and then well, you know, it took so long time, and then we went to Pamplona, and then it didn't work, and then we went slow catering, essentially. So if you're well off, you're able to buy these therapies. So I think the one is the different views on it. I think practically it can be drastically reduced, because what companies look at is they look at the investment and that went into development of the product. This is number one. Second, they look at what kind of lifetime, what does it mean to potential cure, the outcome, and what are the costs that would go into a patient's treatment. They're usually for patients with hematological malignancies. It may be about the same number in the US, and in Europe it's about maybe 300,000 or so. So we're looking at these costs, but Borrow and others essentially, if we look at production, then it's possible there were lawsuits in Brazil essentially, and Brazil now offers cell therapies for about, the price tag is 80,000. Okay, and this is and they're potentially curative treatments. Probably the production costs themselves are anything, depending which country, between 20 and 40,000. If you look at a standard chemotherapy in Europe, patients with a GI malignancy, an insurance pays easily 120,000 per year with standard chemotherapy. So I think costs can be reduced, and this is a very complex issue. And then there is something that is the benevolence that comes through into the back door, and then this kind of is a concern that we may have some sort of the Wild West of therapies, because then centers say, well, we can do this too. And then, but how does a patient know that a CAR T-cell therapy in CTA is as good and safe as in CTB? Who quality controls it? Would an insurance pay for CTA and B? This is so there needs to be that the Wild West element needs to be taken out. I think this was a very, so what this answer showed you, there are very, very complex factors. But I strongly believe, and I think many people would agree, if they're in cell therapy will only survive if this becomes one leg as radiotherapy, surgery, chemotherapy, and immunotherapy / cell therapy. And this will have a price, and maybe it needs to be a price tag. This is what because human beings make decisions, like an autologous transplant. Because what is the cell therapy? It's part of your own cells that are genetically modified or not. And this, with the risks associated, I think it will, people will vote with their feet, and there is a way to make this much more affordable. And in Brazil, that's I think this most of the amazing example. It was a lawsuit of the people against the state. They said, well, we want to have access to this. Why only the rich guys? So it's 80,000. Government pays for it. People don't need to wait for their child dying of a leukemia or lymphoma. They get access to it. So it already exists.
Only two comments. One is, the other day I was very lucky because I met Carl Jung, Madrid. No, Carl Jung, Carl Jung, which is one of the fathers of CAR T, and he told us, we gave him an award in Madrid, and he told us that he's working in the area of solid tumors, and he thinks that in the future, in the next future, we are going to have something about solid tumors. So he thinks at least that his CAR T is able in the future for solid tumors, so let's see. But it was his opinion, but his opinion, I think, has a special value, perhaps. And related to responsibility, I think that there is a kind of principle which is different to precautionary principle, but the problem is that we have not developed well this principle. I think it's very useful. We developed it in the area of weapons. Even at UNESCO, we talk about this is the dual-use dilemma. Even we don't use the expression principle for dual use. We use dual-use dilemma when we are talking about a principle, which is a different principle if you compare to precautionary principle. And it means that when, for me, this is one of the problems when we are talking about the development of biotechnology and the position of the researcher, that sometimes the researcher is thinking about the benefit. I am developing something for the benefit, even considering the dignity of the human beings. But the problem is that someone is able to use it in a different way to harm or to go against dignity. So for me, dual use, and I think that we need to develop more and more, and we can find something about dual use in the current Artificial Intelligence Act of the European Union. There is a mention, not expressly of the principle, but of the idea. So I think it's very important, this idea, if when I am developing something, I need to think not only about the thing that, or the target I want to get, I need to think also if someone is able to use to harm the individuals. I think this is important because the problem is not because I want to develop to harm, but someone is able to use, and we have this case about, for example, chimeras in China with a Spanish researcher involved. He's not trying to develop chimeras to harm dignity or to harm individuals or to harm, but someone is able to use his development or his improvement to develop chimeras. Imagine to have a chimera in the future. So I think dual use could play a main role, but we need to improve this principle because now, even now, we don't call it principle. We talk about dilemma, which is strange. But dual use, I think, is we need to focus on this. Perhaps is not the only way to solve the idea of responsibility or to address responsibility, but perhaps it's a way to address, in my opinion.
May I say just one thing? The problem of the dual use dilemma for me is the question of whether this dual use becomes evident a posteriori or a priori, so to speak. In other words, different is the responsibility if the question is to address the potential dual use post factum, so to speak. Another thing is to address the question of the potential dual use a priori, meaning here is the question of responsibility. That is, that certain things should not be developed precisely because they could be used in a certain way, right? Yeah, I would need to think a little bit more about that, so I'm thankful for the provocation. I just want to make another observation on the question of cost, because obviously this is the kind of problem that we should address not purely in financial terms, but the question here is the question of what the question of responsibility has to do or has to say with the issue of cost. Right. And so here the problem is, of course, a problem of public health policy, a problem of general criteria of distribution, but it's also a problem of whether research is obligatory as a moral imperative. This is the question that Dan Callahan posed many years ago, or whether research is obligatory, in fact, vis-a-vis the problems of public health. So I live in the States, and I cannot, deny the fact that we have 50 million people without insurance. And so the question, for example, of not precautionary health, preventive health is, from an ethical point of view, more stringent, in that sense mandatory, than the obligation to research, right? Now, as I said, those are not questions that we can address in a light or superficial fashion, right? They ought to become part of a rational public health policy. But from a strictly philosophical point of view, vis-a-vis the question of responsibility, for me the issue is what exactly is the duty in front of us when we face a certain type of health crisis.
Very, very interesting point. And I like your view on post festum or not. But if you look at most of the therapies, actually they should not have happened. Because when Carl June developed the car, it was a postdoc, and everybody predicted it's not going to work. When Rosenberg infused the first patients, actually was a number of patients, probably the trial would have been stopped under the current guidelines, ethical framework, right? And so a number of platforms that we have were developed as la pour la, because people were curious, and then turned out to be, despite all, look at the Nobel Prize regarding mRNA. Kiko had, she gave 2 years ago a presentation at the Papal Academy. So suddenly there is a reality in the room that intelligent people see how things could be, and that's utilized in different ways. And utilization is an important point then. But if you look historically, for instance, they were developed as with serendipity and curiosity. And or the Nobel Prize for dendritic cells, Steinman, who got the first Nobel Prize posthum, died a few days before it was announced. He squeezed the cells out from dead skin from dead people, and then had 2 growth factors with science paper in which we're able to produce dendritic cells. These are cells that tell us what to do. And essentially, so this was and are the mainstay of how we can direct the immune system. So most of these discoveries were not made with a European research program or with an NIH grant. If you look where most Nobel Prizes come from, they come from individuals with relatively small groups without a program, and there needs to be the serendipity of people who take this on. It's not always the case, but then the question is, how would you utilize it?
I wonder whether, to a certain extent, ethics could be taken out of the equation here on treatments. I used to work in the vaccine development field, and the calculation that was used in the UK in order to determine whether a childhood vaccine could be implemented or would be paid for by the NHS was a calculation called the units of healthy life saved by the intervention. So, for example, when the latest meningococcal vaccine, the MenC vaccine, was introduced, they did that calculation and it came up that it was too expensive. But they then modified it because the meningitis charities, mostly advocates from parents who had lost children to meningitis, or children were severely disabled by meningitis, argued that they had to take into account the family of bereaved children, and that ought to be brought into the equation as well. And that is done now, as far as I know, still done. That is considered, and then the meningitis vaccine was rolled out in the UK, and then subsequently in other countries. And it strikes me that a calculation like that, the problem with ethics, everyone has different ethics. Just do a calculation, and you can decide whether this treatment is more effective for delivering years of healthy life saved than another treatment. And isn't it more sensible to kind of stop arguing about the ethics and just say, well, okay, what's it cost, and what's the possibility of having another treatment that is more or less effective?
Maybe I'll comment on that and I'll give it to Roberto. Yes, I can just say yes. Because one of the brave examples and one of the key words I used down was courage. Because most of the patients actually, they receive these treatments, and this is, and I don't want to go down your slippery slope, is very interesting, because actually these are individuals who have stage 4 disease, and for instance, this treatment for a lot of this TIL therapy, tumor-infiltrated lymphocytes, If this is given before you would give expensive checkpoint inhibitor, has a response rate of 60–70%. If you get a standard therapy in between, it drops down to 23%, but it gives you most likely lifelong, which means then more than 5 years protection. And it was a very courageous doctor in Amsterdam, patient with metastatic melanoma. Usually it's stage 4, so you have tremendous disease and you get the drug, which is very costly. And then he had the courage to say, well, you know, patients which usually would be operated on, but essentially are much more healthy. And the response rate was amazing. So they would not have to undergo surgery. So there is really also a reflection that we compare everything with the standard of care. And this fits very well with your meningococcal vaccine. What would happen if we would give potential robust, feasible, and potentially curative therapies earlier? And there is an entire international discussion going on because we know this would be the case. But then it takes really the international community because there are risks also associated with it, with anything that we are used to in medical practice. We just forgot it. Allogeneic stem cell transplantation happened after the horrible radiation events, and it took more than 70 people in order to have one patient survive, and then they died of a cytomegalovirus positive white lung. This is how I think we are much more sensitive. But I think your point is extremely well taken. Look at the numbers and look at the families that are being affected.
Yeah, I remember an American senator once said, if we all decided to die 2 weeks earlier, we'd save 20% of the health budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the problem. That's exactly the problem. Meaning the unity of healthy life saved calculation is an impersonal calculation that doesn't take into account the question, whose life, right?
What makes it good?
Well, again, this will be a conversation for a different time, but it seems to me that responsibility has something to say also in the way it ought to address the question of whether this kind of calculation is supposed to be purely impersonal, somehow behind the veil of ignorance, to use a statement by, or a metaphor publicized by John Rawls, or whether in fact should be a calculation that takes into account precisely the face of the people that are being saved. It's different than that if you save children or if you save the elderly, or whether through a certain type of calculation you are just saying, well, let's all of them who belong to, say, the vulnerable side of the population go south, because after all, they count less in the sort of quantitative version of what healthy life means. So I don't know whether I made myself clear, but the question of responsibility to me is the question of responsibility toward the face, as the philosopher Levinas would say. Responsibility is never impersonal, is never toward an impersonal neuter. Responsibility is always toward somebody who has a face and therefore has a need, and as such needs to be addressed.
May I ask you back before we have two more questions and then probably have to come to a conclusion. I just would like to ask you back, because you were talking about courage. You know, some people who saw the patient and who gave the treatment to somebody who was not supposed to get the treatment, you know, before it was. So isn't No? So I misunderstood you. So because I thought having courage and seeing the hope of people who want to be treated, I mean, this is an interpersonal thing that is happening. You know that we have some knowledge and there is somebody who needs help and you think you can help. So this is also a personal encounter. So I wonder whether this does not has a role in, let's say, in what you said, because courage is a virtue, so that's developing something in your side,
Let me define this very carefully, because courage means here, this was related to a clinical trial that was, of course, supervised and so on, to move a potentially curative treatment to patients actually who were exhausted, everything, were in clinically very bad shape. The courage to say, well, we may have everything, every point is that you may have a better result and people responding with a higher frequency if we go to an earlier stage disease, of course with the unknown risk of the side effects in this patient population. And essentially this, of course, this is not on a one-to-one person level that you make kind of a compassionate use, this, because I strongly believe that things need to be done in phase 1 clinical trial. They need to be observed. This needs to be very clearly structured. So the courage, but still, it's still you're facing then as a doctor your patients. So, well, you want to be enrolled in these clinical trials. We went sails through all the different committees of the EMA or the FDA. Because essentially it's the first treatment that we would be able to offer you at this stage of the disease, but we may expect certain side effects and so on. And that's the courage that I mean. And this is a strong, it's always good that there's a multi-center trial. These are big centers with expertise. This is the courage I meant, because because otherwise we would just perpetuate the current treatment modalities, which we don't want to. Kevin, you.
Okay, yeah. So I'm from the University of Manchester. Just a comment on the sort of technocratic solution suggested, which I don't think work. Because pharmaceutical pricing is essentially a game. It's a very complex game, but it's between a buyer and a seller. And unfortunately, the seller can afford better healthcare economists than the buyer can in most circumstances. Secondly, apart from a few markets, there's no need to sell in any particular market. Sellers can say, well, if you don't want to pay in the UK what we want to sell it for to you, we don't have to sell it. We can get profit enough by doing it elsewhere. And secondly, we have the problem that we don't actually know what these things cost. We know what the list price is, but in most countries don't pay the list price. Most countries negotiate a discount, but it's confidential for obvious reasons. So essentially we can't have a technocratic system, or if we want, we would have to change the way we negotiate pharmaceutical prices fundamentally and have transparency. And that would be an enormous change.
Yeah. Good. Yes.
So,
Kevin.
yeah, hi. Maybe just, first of all, thanks for 2 excellent presentations and a great Q&A. This is really terrific. Maybe just following up, Roberto, on your initial comments on germline editing. And I mean, from my very simplistic way of thinking, the gulf between somatic cell editing, gene editing and gene therapy, and germline editing is about 1 mile wide and about 10 miles deep, given the practical realities around what is the real unmet medical need, practically the risk-benefit equation, how many years it would take to actually really think about doing clinical trials. So that's to my very simplistic way of thinking, but maybe you could both comment on, do you see it as that wide and that deep? Do you think it's the technologies are a little bit more blurred together? How do you guys think about it vis-a-vis frameworks? Thanks.
I don't know. I confess I can't answer the question.
I don't have an answer either, because I think the germline discussion is exactly as deep as you alluded to. I think that's a totally different discussion as compared to the discussion we had here, because otherwise we go then we are already on the slippery slope, and we don't know what kind of how slippery, what the decree is, and what kind of lube is used in order that we go down faster.
So just quick point, which again we can save for a future conversation. Back to the idea of using algorithms and things to excuse me, help us solve this issue. They only work in the extent we allow them to, right? So, excuse me, during COVID, everybody had to come up with an algorithm to say, what do we do when we run out of respirators, right? And our med students wrestled with this, and they came up with all these great, wonderful algorithms. And, oh, thank you. And one of the things they all agreed on was the mother from a minority community with 4 children coming in, needing the respirator, should get the respirator before the 58-year-old white guy who didn't have any dependents and, you know, wonderful insurance and all that, but still she should get it first. And I said, really? You're going to tell the hospital administrator that the governor of Nebraska is not going to get the respirator before this woman? And of course, then, you know, well, who told me it was the governor of Nebraska? Well, the 58-year-old white guy, that's who that is. So we have ways of using algorithms, but we always find ways to sort of undermine them, which then brings me to the question I think we can wrestle with as we go forward. Is everybody's responsibility the same? I mean, don't different people have different responsibilities in terms of how they can be called to responsibility with this question, so the doctor in front of the patient is committed to doing the best that the doctor can do for the patient, whereas the researcher might have different responsibilities at the bench, whereas the person in the pharmaceutical industry has different responsibilities. Now that just complicates everything, but I think it also allows us to get at this in a more comprehensive and constructive way, to be able to say we're not going to come up with a one-size-fits-all responsibility solution.
So that leaves us space for future conferences. And I'd like to thank the 2 speakers very much, and hand over to the flash talks of this afternoon.